the summer months.
The member for Centre-Mart.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the UN International Panel on Climate Change released their final warning. We need to act now to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. Their call was clear. The time for incremental progress is over. We need to rapidly change our society and lifestyles to secure a livable future. The IPCC has also been clear. There can be no new fossil fuel infrastructure. This means no new pipelines, no new fracking for gas, no new LNG export terminals. Instead of getting stuck in the dying sunset industries of decades past, we need to move bravely into a renewable future. Quebec recognized this by banning all future fossil fuel development last year. Considering the dire warnings of the IPCC report that was released on Monday, will the Premier take the necessary action of banning any new fossil fuel development here in New Brunswick?
The Minister of Environment and Climate Change.
Thank you very much, the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, for the question. Certainly, we're looking at all fossil fuel reductions over time, and you know that as well, or more than most. We are looking at other energies as well regarding the use of hydrogen, windmills, which apparently with the storm most recently wouldn't have helped us a great deal. Things are ongoing right now, things meaning that we are taking action. We can't solve the world problems. There's countries doing less than we are. We are doing a lot here in New Brunswick. I'd like to assure the member opposite and everyone else in the House that we are taking action against climate change to make a positive difference. I'm driving that electric car myself. How far does it go? I'll get back to you next month. That's maybe not. That's certain education in itself. The new plan. Our new plan does include 30 focused, measurable actions with deliverables. We are working on it. We're working hard, and it is ongoing. We're working on it. It's not put on the back burner.
Member for Reynolds Centre-Mart.
Mr. Speaker, the whole point is we don't have a lot of time. And while that is not nonsense, we do not have time. And yes, okay, so the Minister of Environment and Climate Change has an EV. That is not going to solve our problems. The Premier wants to frack in this province. Mr. Speaker, the Premier has a one-track mind. It's stuck in the 1970s. Time and time again, we've seen him living in a fantasy land, shilling for fossil fuel projects that even fossil fuel companies have abandoned. First, it was Energy East Pipeline, which he insisted needed to be built, even after TransCanada said the project was dead. Then he lifted the moratorium on fracking in the Sussex area without consulting First Nations. 4 years later, despite the Premier's insistence otherwise, nobody's interested in exploring shale gas in New Brunswick, and his pet project, LNG export terminal, despite Repsol's insistence that it is not economically feasible. Will the Premier finally admit that it's time to move on from fossil fuels?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, back here about a month ago when we had this -40 weather, was the first time in history that the Quebec shut us off on electricity. We've never seen that before. And Mr. Speaker, fortunately we had La Pro up and running, we had Baldoon up and running, we had Coulson up and running, we had the gas plants up and running. So we had all hands on deck. But you know the windmills that were up and running? And everybody thought, boy, they're doing well because the wind's blowing really hard. Too hard for them. Many of them shut down, because they just can't blow in the high winds, or they can't generate in high winds. So, Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the member opposite and all the issues that we're facing, but the reality is, Mr. Speaker, they don't want nuclear either. So the gap is huge, and the transition requirements are real. So I think the point is it's a time for a reality check, Mr. Speaker, that goes beyond the talk and gets into the reality of how we have energy security going forward, not only for our province, but for the world, Mr. Speaker. And we want to dig up every site trying to find minerals for batteries, because that's what it's going to take, and it is a mission impossible, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Member for Memon-Cook Centre-Mart.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, let's look at the reality. Let's look at what the science says. It requires action. It requires getting off fossil fuel. It requires no new fossil fuel infrastructure. And imagine if past governments had invested more in solar, in wind, in batteries. What if this government really invested in energy efficiency? But no, this Premier is out of touch. He talks about the energy transition, but does not understand what is necessary for a livable future for our children and our grandchildren. The IPCC issued their final warning on Monday, but instead we're going to keep barreling down the highway towards climate hell. And there have been climate strikes across the province. Unfortunately, I didn't see any of the Conservative MLAs at the climate strike that was here on Tuesday. The Premier wasn't there. The Minister of Environment and Climate Change wasn't there. It shows climate change is not really a priority for this government. Since the Premier refused to answer my question on Wednesday, I'll ask again. Does he agree with declaring a climate change emergency?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, there's no question the climate's changing. We all see it. We see it in every winter. We see it every spring. We see it constantly. So there's no question about that, Mr. Speaker. The challenge is how do we react and how do we manage through this? So one case you'd see that in our case the federal government decided, well, we'll penalize everybody. Well, how's that working for us, Mr. Speaker? And on the carbon tax, for us now, we were spending all that on climate action items, Mr. Speaker, or tax reduction. Every dime on on tax reductions or climate action projects, every dime. But, Mr. Speaker, now it's going out to monthly checks. So how much do you think, because the federal government have imposed the backstop, how much do you think is going to change in the climate usage because of that? We put $300+ million into a home heat program, Mr. Speaker, for heat pumps. So, Mr. Speaker, there's a process here, and the honourable member opposite needs to understand the reality of what's going to cause us to have enough energy to survive and thrive, Mr. Speaker, because the holes that she doesn't speak about are real. And let's get all the facts on the table.
Time to be here.